Trump had this phone call with Putin. And that phone call changed everything because that phone call injected reality into this discussion. And then Pete Hegseth went off to NATO and J.D. Vance went off to Munich. And their job was to be disruptive. And they did it. They threw little grenades into these rooms and got Europe in a panic, spinning amongst itself. That's what you do because this is political maneuver warfare, the OODA loop writ large. Your job is to get them to react to you and continue that cycle of action reaction until you shoot them down and then destroy them. Do you think Donald Trump forgets this or will forgive this? No. Donald Trump is in the midst of a revolution, a domestic revolution that we've seen manifested in the takedown of USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and others, and a foreign policy revolution where he's redefining our relationships where we will no longer be held captive by entities such as the European Union and NATO that openly conspire against the sitting president of the United States of America. That is intolerable, and it won't be tolerated going forward. The British are a joke right now. They're actively trying to sabotage everything Donald Trump's trying to do, and Donald Trump is a counter-puncher. He's also a man with thin skin, and he's very vindictive. That's not necessarily the best of traits, but when you know those traits exist, why insult the man knowing that he's going to counterpunch and come at you personally? This is personal for Donald Trump. He will humiliate Starmer by the time this is finished.
The ground is shaking beneath the foundations of NATO and the European Union. The illusion of unity is cracking, and behind closed doors, desperation is setting in. If Scott Ritter is right, we are witnessing a global power shift unlike anything we've seen in decades, where old alliances crumble and a new order emerges, shaped by revenge, economic warfare, and political maneuvering at the highest levels. Scott Ritter paints a picture of a world in chaos, where Europe scrambles for control as Donald Trump prepares for a political reckoning. He suggests that NATO and the EU are trapped in their own web of deception, while Trump, emboldened by his return, seeks to dismantle the very institutions that sought to restrain him. The battle lines are drawn, not just in foreign policy, but in a revolution that could reshape America's global stance forever. We've just dissected Scott Ritter's latest statements, exposing the contradictions and challenges in his analysis. But now, let's pivot to an even more explosive development, one that is shaking the very foundations of the Ukraine war. A ceasefire deal was just activated, and it's not just any ceasefire. It's a convoluted, chaotic, and potentially catastrophic agreement that could dictate the future course of the war. And just as this so-called ceasefire comes into play, Russia has launched a brutal new offensive into Sumy Oblast. What's happening? Why does this ceasefire seem more like a trap than a truce? Let's break it all down. The most insane ceasefire. Just activated Russians push into Sumy Oblast. In a shocking turn of events, the latest ceasefire agreement, brokered through discussions in Saudi Arabia, has left the world scratching its head. The details of the deal are murky, and each side is telling a completely different version of events. The United States, Russia, and Ukraine have all put forward their own interpretations, and, unsurprisingly, they don't line up. Russia's version, a 30-day ceasefire. But on whose terms? According to the Kremlin, Russia and the United States have agreed to implement the Black Sea Initiative, which includes ensuring safe navigation and banning the use of commercial vessels for military purposes. But buried within this agreement is a much more critical clause, a mutual ban on strikes against energy facilities in Russia and Ukraine, set to last 30 days from March 18, 2025. Sounds straightforward, right? Wrong. Because while Russia claims the ceasefire clock started on March 18th, Ukraine has a completely different take. Ukraine's version, when does the ceasefire actually start? Unlike Russia, Ukraine's leadership, specifically President Zelensky, didn't confirm any specific start date. Instead, Zelensky stated that the ceasefire would only come into effect once an official statement was issued by the White House. And according to Ukrainian officials, that statement didn't come until March 25th. In other words, Ukraine believes the ceasefire should run from March 26th to April 25th, while Russia insists it started on March 18th and should end on April 17th. This means there will be a dangerous week-long gap between the two sides' interpretations of when the truce actually expires. And that gap could be the spark that reignites full-scale war. The immediate fallout, a breach before the truce, even began. Adding to the chaos, Ukraine continued launching attacks on Russian energy infrastructure even after March 18th, hitting oil refineries, gas transport systems, and key industrial sites. Russia, furious over these strikes, now argues that Ukraine has already broken the agreement before it was even fully in effect. So what's the consequence? Here's where it gets truly dangerous. The looming disaster, Russia's retaliation window. Because Ukraine continued attacking Russian energy facilities after March 18th, the Kremlin now believes it has the right to resume full-scale attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure as soon as April 18th hits. And when that happens, Ukraine will be left in a precarious position. The worst part? The United States might not come to Kiev's rescue. Washington was involved in negotiating the ceasefire's terms, and if Russia argues that it upheld its end of the deal while Ukraine violated it, the Biden administration may refuse to impose further sanctions or send additional weapons. In other words, Ukraine could be left exposed just as Russia regains the freedom to strike. Russia's response: an invasion into Sumy Oblast. And here's where things take an even darker turn. While the world was busy trying to make sense of this bizarre ceasefire, Russia launched a significant new offensive, this time pushing into Sumy Oblast. Russian forces, emboldened by what they see as Ukraine's violation of the truce, have ramped up their attacks in the northeast. Reports indicate that Russian battalions are making territorial gains, attempting to establish a foothold just across the border. The timing is no coincidence. Russia knows that if it escalates now, while Ukraine is tied up in diplomatic knots, it could make strategic advances before Kiev even has a chance to respond. Zelensky's dilemma: fight back or risk losing Western support. So now, Zelensky faces an impossible choice. Does he retaliate and risk being blamed for breaking the ceasefire, possibly jeopardizing U.S. military aid? Or does he hold back, allowing Russian troops to carve deeper into Sumy Oblast? The stakes couldn't be higher. If Ukraine is forced to accept the Russian timeline for the ceasefire, it means Russian forces will have free rein to attack from April 18th to April 25th, while Ukraine remains bound by the truce. This could be a disaster, allowing Russia to carry out massive strikes without consequences. A masterstroke or a miscalculation? At this point, it's hard to say whether Russia has played a brilliant strategic move or if this whole situation will backfire spectacularly. On one hand, Moscow has positioned itself in a way that justifies further aggression while claiming to be the responsible party upholding the ceasefire agreement. On the other hand, if the West decides to interpret Ukraine's timeline as the correct one, Russia's next round of strikes could be seen as a violation, potentially triggering a harsh response from NATO. Either way, this so-called ceasefire has done nothing to de-escalate the war. In fact, it set the stage for an even bloodier confrontation in the coming weeks. What we're witnessing right now is the calm before the storm. Russia has skillfully maneuvered itself into a position where it can claim to be following the ceasefire while still preparing for a major escalation. Meanwhile, Ukraine is caught between maintaining Western support and defending its territory from Russian incursions into Sumy. Mark your calendars, April 18th to April 25th, could be the most pivotal period in this war so far. Will Russia unleash a full-scale assault on Ukraine's energy infrastructure? Will the US and Europe step in to stop it? Or will this entire ceasefire collapse, triggering an all-out war? One thing is clear: this isn't peace. This is a ticking time bomb, and the countdown has already begun.